It started with a visit to Anzac Cove, Gallipoli, by director Peter Weir in 1976, and became a 5-year journey to bring the Australian experience in World War I to the big screen. Using first-hand accounts chronicled by Bill Gammage in his book The Broken Years, and the journals of war correspondent Charles Bean, celebrated playwright David Williamson wrote a screenplay which gave birth to an Australian film classic. Winner of 8 AFI awards and consistently voted as the greatest Australian movie ever made, Peter Weir's Gallipoli is as important today as when first released 33 years ago. At the core of the movie is a simple story of Aussie mateship thrust onto the front line of war. Gallipoli tells the tale of Archie Hamilton, played by Mark Lee, and Frank Dunn, played by Mel Gibson, two sprint runners who in 1915 enlist in the Australian Armed Forces and quickly find themselves in Turkey for the horrific Gallipoli campaign of World War I. And we have one of those mates here tonight, Mark Lee. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Thank you.
Now, the movie has become synonymous with Australia's involvement in World War I. The great historian, Bill Gammage, said that Gallipoli holds a myth that is so strong and yet so fragile, a myth about mateship, courage and bravery, the bravery of those who fell and those who felt pain by their fall. Now, how important do you think the movie has been in furthering this myth?
It's played an important role. I think one of the things about the film is that it came at a point when we began to perceive the participants in the conflict as separate from the politics and the war, which is the horrific machine that eats people up. And because we'd had Vietnam, we'd had all the protests, the younger generation really despised the RSL at that point. There was a real us and them mentality. And somewhere about 1980, about the time that they were putting in pre-production of the film, the younger generation began to realise that the participants were human beings, and Bill Gammage's book had a lot to do with this. These wonderful letters that he edited and spoke about, and his great affection for the men who served. And a younger generation then began to look at that, and feelings changed. We saw them as human beings. And it was the first time we'd done that. And we were to do that with Vietnam veterans a little later, who were incredibly shortchanged in the way they were treated when they returned.
Did you know much yourself about World War I before you started shooting?
No, I loved history. My big thing in history was actually American history in the 19th century. Other than what I'd done at school, which was a fairly, a little bit of Patsy Adams Smith, a little bit of Bean. Hadn't thought about it too much until the film started. We did have the opportunity to meet a lot of the veterans who were still alive then, which was very moving. And very funny too. A lot of them couldn't work out why we would possibly want to make a film about something that they spent most of their lives trying to forget. Yeah. But they were very helpful. Reticent to talk about what they'd done, because they weren't soldiers. I mean, they were carpenters, they were farm labourers, stockmen, and to them, they went to this conflict and came back and then tried to sort of piece their lives back together. So
did the movie change your attitude, say, to Anzac Day and Remembrance Day?
Yes, it did. It did. I again began to think of it on more of a human level than a sort of a global or a political level, which I think was important because, quite often we're thrust into conflicts for whatever reason. I think also the big problem is, and the thing that always worries me about this, is that if the circle turns further, it becomes nationalism and jingoism, which is something you have to avoid, which is not what the film was. It was a study of men who'd gone through this experience together and survived and come back to this new nation. So I think there's always a problem with these sorts of films that it will affect. I mean, I met a young guy once who said he joined the army because of it. And I sort of went, oh, that's not quite what we wanted.
Was there ever a point, given that in the making of the film, that you and the rest of the cast and the crew felt that you were making something that was more than just, say, a piece of entertainment, just a movie?
Initially, no. Initially, it was like a pretty slightly jaded group of wonderful technicians who were doing another Outback film. They're on location, we're having a ball. Two things that happened, which was very odd. One, it was shot in sequence, almost entirely in sequence, which almost never happens on a film. So we started at the beginning By the time we finished the final battle sequences, it was pretty close to the end of the filming. During that time, we had a lot of extras from Port Lincoln who played soldiers, and they were tuna fishermen, they were country boys, they were pretty much the guys that would have gone originally.
Ah, yes, of course.
And they began to lock into it. They would turn up to watch the dailies or the rushes, which were then shown on a 35mm projector. And they would scream for them to be shown 2 and 3 times. And then it was packed. The production office, you couldn't move. There were people bringing in 6-packs. And then suddenly you'd look down, a couple of these guys would get really teary watching friends of theirs, and it was acting, it was special effects being sort of shot to pieces. Yeah. And that's when we realised. And then the crew played a lot of cameos all the way through it. They suddenly wanted to be in one shot.
Well, David Williamson turns up himself, doesn't he? He plays a
football
a ruckman doing a big tap over the head.
Yeah. But we had several of the crew in the last sequences where they had single shots in the trenches. Quite often they were gaffers, cook's assistants, just wanting to be a little part of it. So, yeah, as it progressed, people sort of felt it was something that was important to them.
Now, Weir and his production crew took, great pains to make the film as authentic as possible, but there's been, well, following the film, there was a fair amount of criticism, wasn't there, about certain aspects of it?
Yeah, a lot of it pertained to a slight on the British, which was a line where they talk about the British drinking cups of tea on the beach, which was a little unfair because the British actually took a hammering that day.
Yes.
The biggest criticism and the most unfair one is about John Morris, who plays the officer that keeps the attack going. And they said he was British, and actually it was an educated Australian accent of the time. He had researched it and done this wonderful accent that was absolutely right for an Australian officer, and they thought it was British. So there was a misunderstanding.
Now, it's been said that your character was inspired by a description that Charles Bean himself made of Private Wilfred Harper of the 10th Light Horse during the attack on the Neck. Wilfred was last seen running forward like a schoolboy in a foot race with all the speed he could compass. Did that description affect the way that you played your character?
I would say no, because it was given to us as part of the research to start with. As the film developed and the research grew, suddenly you're developing another character. What did start to affect us was Lambert's painting of the Neck. If you look carefully, and it's not often seen in there, the painting is quite often cropped. But in one corner, there is a young man with no helmet, facing the wrong way, on his knees, blonde hair, looking back. And I mean, Peter on set had the painting, and quite often characters moving were taken from characters in the painting that Lambert constructed.
Extraordinary.
So I mean, Wilfred was part of the original research, but then you sort of get into a role and it takes on a life of its own. So.
Well, it does indeed, yeah. But did any of Wilfred's descendants ever make contact with you?
No, they didn't. In fact, it was hard. The Neck was a problem because it was buried. Even Bean sort of brushes over it slightly because it was such an embarrassment.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of tragedies. I mean, there's a Victoria Cross in the War Memorial belonging to someone who committed suicide in the 20s who was in that attack and survived. My brother-in-law was a vet in Western Australia and met a veteran who he thought was an infantryman. He was served in France.
Yeah.
As he got to know him, he found out he was not just an infantryman. He'd been with the 3rd Light Horse Brigade. He was at the Neck. He survived because he stood on a bowling ball bomb. You know those strange little... And it blew him up in the air. And when he landed in a crater.
God.
And woke up in the night and slowly crawled back. And he didn't want to talk about it anymore. He said he lost, so many friends. And
it was carnage, wasn't it? You were saying before that the Neck itself, we're talking about a very small area, aren't we? I mean, it's the size of a couple of tennis courts.
Yeah, a couple of tennis courts. I think at the shortest sort of distance, it was about 25 yards, so under 25 metres. So it was an extraordinary thing to happen. It was very, it was 18th century, 19th century warfare thrown into the 20th century because no one had the guns loaded. Wilfred ran because he didn't have a rifle, and he wasn't the only one. Several of them did. By the time, there were actually 4 waves. The film has 3. Yeah. There was a 4th. So after the carnage had happened, after the 3rd, they still sent a 4th wave over, and they had 2 more waiting in 2 trenches back from the South Australian Light Horse, the 9th. And I met 2 veterans from that, and they waited listening, thinking that they were next up. Finally, someone stopped it.
What did it feel like as an actor at that very moment when you take part in this recreation? I mean, in the film it's extraordinary. Bill Hunter's playing the officer and his hand is trembling. You know, there's an extraordinary sense of foreboding about that moment. As a performer, how did you feel kind of internally just then?
By this stage, we'd been filming for over 2 months and we'd become very close. It was incredibly moving, and as I said, even with extras from the town of Port Lincoln, they began to sort of get moved by the whole thing. And it's a very odd feeling to describe, but it just... and watching Bill Hunter, magnificent performance, you know, itself. And I was 22, you know, first sort of big thing I'd done, and the whole thing was sort of overwhelming to a large degree. But it was something that just, it took your breath away. And finally, when the attack happened and there was firing happening around you and you're watching people just drop like puppets. And
a sense of total identification.
It was odd. Yes.
Yeah. I played a soldier in the Vietnam War in the film The Odd Angry Shot, and the young actors, again, we were all in our early 20s, all identified totally with the characters we were playing. We became mad larrikin sort of soldier guys. Did you and the other actors feel the same thing? Did you sort of kind of identify so much with the characters that you became them off screen a bit?
Yes, off screen, yes.
You did a bit.
We did a little, yeah, yes. I'm just so pleased there was no social media back then. I just...
What are they up to this week? Where are they tonight?
Yeah, it just would be horrible. But we did, and we lived in Port Lincoln. We took over the town for 6 weeks, and so we did. And it just you find yourself, you know, sort of moving through things, willing it to work. I mean, I've worked on productions, and I'm sure you have, where you do get a little jaded that things are not happening the way you want to, and this was an odd one where all the pieces were connecting. John Seal was a camera operator. You know, he wasn't there.
Academy Award winner now.
Yeah, and it was beautiful working with someone like that.
So finally, why do you think the film remains so important?
That's a really interesting question. When my youngest daughter, who's now 24, was at high school, I was on her history book, which horrified her. I mean, you know, when you're 14, you don't... Things like that, you don't want to stand out. And so we allowed her to deface, the only book I've ever allowed her to deface, and she defaced me.
She drew a moustache. No, she didn't.
Yeah. No, I think she did a drag queen. I think because it's been used as a teaching and educational tool, and it seems to have woven itself into the psyche a bit about, and especially now with the 100 years coming up next year, and it's gone beyond, is this a good film or a bad film? It's kind of just woven itself in, and we think about it as we think about the history. It's a very odd thing to have been involved in.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.